and welcome to Mythmakers. Mythmakers is the podcast for fantasy fans and fantasy creatives, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. My name is Julia Golding, and today I am joined by two titans of the fantasy field, in that I am joined by Ana Sampson, who is an experienced editor and author of anthologies that often skew towards poems in the world of fantasy, and also by, hardly needs an introduction, by Chris Riddell, who is, there are so many things I could say about Chris, but let's just say he's previously the UK Children's Laureate in 2015 to 17, and he's won a huge number of awards. He has a very distinct style that, if I just mention the front cover of Neil Gaiman's The Graveyard book, or indeed Chris's series, The Edge Chronicles, written with Paul Stewart, The Edge Chronicles, you'll probably instantly be able to know who I'm talking about. And if that wasn't enough, he's also a political cartoonist, and no doubt is very busy with the world politics at the moment.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Welcome both to the podcast. We are talking today, though, about this new book, which is published by Macmillan, called Heroes and Villains, Poems About Legends. So before we start talking about this particular collection, I was wondering, as you're collaborating on a poetry compendium together, do you have a particular poem that you came across as a child that you've carried along with you in your own little anthology inside your head? I've got one which I can share with you, but let's hear what you come up with.
Well, I've got one instantly, and that goes back absolutely to my childhood. And that is possibly the greatest fantasy poem ever written. And that is The Jabberwocky.
Ah,
Um,
yes.
at the beginning of Alice Through the Looking Glass, there it is, read in mirror writing. And what beguiled me completely was the fact that it seemed to make no sense, and yet I understood it. And it was that sort of alchemy that fascinated me as a child. "'Twas brillig, and the slithy toads did gyre and gimmer," just wonderful, evocative words that sort of didn't mean anything, except maybe in an imaginative way. And it spoke to me as then a sort of, a young child who enjoyed drawing. It spoke to my visual imagination. And I think fantasy often does that, the creating of worlds we wish to inhabit, we want to visualize. And that, I suppose, began my illustration journey.
That is perfect. I imagine you must have drawn the Vorpal blade going snicker snack all
Oh,
in your
definitely.
textbooks. Yes. How about you, Anna? Obviously, you know huge numbers of poems now, but what was the one that you thought of when you were younger that,
As
lit your imagination?
as soon as Chris said Jabberwocky, I realised that, of course, all of the Alice poems are there
Mm.
really from very early. I mean, "Will you walk a little faster?" said of waiting to a snail. I say that to my kids all the time when they're walking what I consider to be very slowly. So definitely the Alice poems. But I think the one that I really remember is The Lady of Shalott,
Oh,
which
yes.
just seemed so kind of beautiful. And I think I was very excited that it was very long. I must have
Yeah.
read it at an age when, that seemed like genuinely a sort of that seemed like Paradise Lost to me. It seemed very, very long. And I
Yeah.
think the idea of Camelot comes so beautifully to life from that. The
And
other
then,
one, and it's not a fantasy one, is the Robert Louis Stevenson, Bed in Summer, which I think of every year around this time. In winter, I get up at light and dressed by yellow candlelight.
I was just thinking about the Lady of Shalott, which appears in your collection.
I've
But
got her in.
it's so visual, but it's also so much about the sound. Like one of the perhaps less famous lines, "Whenever I see a breeze going through willow trees, willows whiten, aspens
And
quiver,
Quiver.
breezes dusk and shiver," it immediately clicks in my brain. I agree. These are such great poems you've chosen. And if anyone listening hasn't read them, immediately stop, put pause on, and go and read them. Ah, thank you, Chris. For those
And
of you who are
we,
watching the YouTube version, again, it might well be worth following this particular episode on the YouTube version because we're going to have Chris doing some illustration for us, and he's showing the beautiful illustration for I think it's an extract, isn't it, of the
it
It's
is,
latest?
extracts, yes, we couldn't fit it all in.
Yeah,
which
yeah.
I was a shame, Anna, but you gave me the absolute best bits,
Oh,
and we
good.
had a very brief conversation before we started recording about lockdown, and I suppose the Lady of Shalott is the ultimate sort of person in lockdown, and she sort of sees the world as many of us do and did during the lockdown through the prism of I would have thought a screen. For her, it's the mirror. And so she sees
Absolutely.
people coming and going through the mirror from the outside world. And it's only the breaking, when she finally sort of, breaks free and the mirror in that wonderful line sort of cracked from side to side. And she emerges. And then we have the sort of ultimate sort of final sort of line delivered by Lancelot that's so beautiful. So it's a deeply romantic poem,
Mm.
also as well as being deeply Gothic, I think.
Yes,
Yes.
there's so much mystery in it. We don't know how she ended up there or why she's there. There's sort of so much happening around the frame of the story in the poem.
She left the web, she left the loom, she made 3 paces through the room. I mean, it's all in the head, just ready to come out.
Mm.
I better stop because there's a lot more in there. Um, so that was the child version of you and your relationship with poetry. And Chris, you said that you found that the Jabberwocky kind of helped you become the illustrator that you have since become. But for someone listening who is wanting to follow in your footsteps, how did you get there? What were what happened to that little boy to get him to be such a well-known illustrator?
Oh my goodness. Well, who knows is the unhelpful answer to that. I suppose a more helpful answer is that I was an inveterate reader, and so I read Tolkien and I read C.S. Lewis and I read Ursula Le Guin and I read a lot of sort of fantasy that was just perfect for illustration. And I attempted to illustrate the books that I read. So I remember sort of drawing the Battle of the Five Armies when I was in sort of, year six, having read The Hobbit and being inspired by it. The other thing I did was I went back to the illustrated books that I loved and would find illustrations that really spoke to me. And I would attempt to copy them. And sometimes copying gets a bad name, but I think it's a great way to analyze how images are made, and particularly illustrations in books, can tell you a lot by careful sort of perusal, and certainly by sort of attempting to recreate the effect that the illustrator has got. So I used to almost obsessively draw the white rabbit from the frontispiece of Alice in Wonderland.
Mm.
Because there was something magical about the way the artist, John Tenniel, conveyed both the character of the rabbit without losing the essential rabbit nature of the character. So there was this, and it was something about the eyes, something about the stance. And I would draw this, and then I would discover the foliage in the background. I would discover the way that Tenniel drew the folds in the jacket. And this just entered my visual imagination. And the great thing about copying is that once you've copied, you can then put that away, but it lives in your visual imagination. So it's a great way to learn. And so I would say sort of, go along to a gallery, get one of those little stools that you often see sort of by the reception. I see far few people sort of doing this, but take a little stool, take it to your favorite exhibit, sit down with your sketchbook, copy something beautiful just for half an hour, and you'll find you'll take that away with you.
Yeah, and what I find really interesting about that idea of copying is that there is a stage in writing about that too. I think Anna will probably agree with me that certainly young writers at school, but also new writers who, as adults, there's no harm at all in doing your fan fiction or your homage to, I don't know, Doctor Who, whatever it is, because you are learning how plots are put together, you're learning voice, you're learning style, you're learning characterization. What could happen to this character? No, that's outside what they would be like. You're learning, coloring in a sense, but
And
it's such a
Anna,
huge,
I
yeah.
was going to say, Anna, isn't that how poetry anthologies work in exactly that way?
Yes, I mean the idea is that you have a buffet of poetry and you sample all of those different styles. And you can go away, obviously, and explore them more fully if there's something that really strikes a chord with you. But I mean, I do think for any kind of writing, I think everything starts with reading. I'm always incredibly shocked when you meet someone who says, "Oh, I've written a book," and then you say, "Oh, and what do you like reading?" And they say, "Oh, no, I don't really read." And you think,
Yeah.
"Your book is bad. I'm sorry." We know that. It's sort of everything starts with experiencing how other people put words together on the page, and you're right, the nuts and bolts of plot and character and those kind of things. And I think when people, I certainly remember going through little periods of writing like, oh, D.H. Lawrence when I was doing my A levels, and somewhere there are presumably a lot of pages of terrible kind of rip-off D.H. Lawrence writing somewhere in a drawer at home.
Yes, that
But
might be quite unintentionally funny because
yeah,
I'm just thinking about the sort of lushness. Um, but just going back to this question of the role of a verse compendium, it is an absolutely gorgeous book. And it reminded me of the kind of books that school libraries must have on the shelves and local libraries. And I was thinking of what compendiums I knew about. I was thinking, of course, the first one I thought of was the Rattlebag with Seamus Heaney and Ted Hughes. But also, Anna, you've already done, and with Chris, Gods and Monsters, mythological poems.
yes,
So,
that's right. So
yeah, now coming to this, what was your mission should you choose to accept it? What was your quest in putting together this particular selection?
well, so Gods and Monsters was mythological poems, of which, of course, there are so many, such an embarrassment of riches. And I sort of thought, well, we've done myths, we need to do legends. And then, of course, my editor said to me, "Wonderful, what's the difference?" And I had to go away and look it up. And of course, the difference is that a legend has a grain of truth, but we have, I think it's fair to say, stretched that definition quite far. So perhaps there are real people like saints and kings and queens and villains and highwaymen at the center of the stories. But some of them, for example, King Arthur, we think perhaps he wasn't a real character, but his legends have been believed and been felt to be true for so long. He gets a pass, so we can
Yeah.
have Guinevere and the knights. We have dragons and beasts because an awful lot of these, there were some beasts like the Minotaur who I don't think that people ever genuinely believed were real and in existence, and you might meet them round a dark corner. But dragons, of course, legends of dragons have popped up in cultures all over the world, perhaps because of the fossil records of dinosaurs being discovered. Um, perhaps that's why. And we have mermaids, which I've allowed us because, of course, sailors might have seen the tails of seals, and at a distance, after a few too many tots of rum, a different kind of legend grows up. So either things that have that germ of truth to them, or things which have sort of taken on the ring of truth over the centuries.
I was
What
interested as well that you often put in two poems around, or even more. I think the Mary Celeste, Boadicea, Boudica. Sometimes they were an older poem. I could recognize it was an older poem with a more modern interpretation, but not always. Is that, I mean, I can guess why you might have done it. You tell me why you did that.
Sometimes I do think, oh, we could have got an extra legendary figure in there, but we've got two Boudicas or two Mary Celestes. I love the way poems talk to each other, and I love showing to readers the ways in which different people, particularly if they're writing perhaps centuries apart, have written about the same subject or the same feeling or the same story or the same legend. And I think when you're putting together an anthology on myths and legends, it's really something important to get across, that we can climb inside these stories and sort of use them in different ways, and that they have been used in different ways, and they have been retold with new sidelights on them over the centuries that they've been popular. So I think with myths and legends, it's particularly important to have perhaps more than one voice.
So
I think
talking about the same story.
I think also, Anna, what I enjoy about your anthologizing, if I may sort of coin it, is the way in which poems can sort of collectively take you on a journey. And so I love the proposition of heroes and villains. So throughout this collection, I was sort of surmising, this is a villainous character, this is a hero. This is a sort of, a situation I wouldn't want to be in because of this character. This is a situation that is entirely wonderful because there's a saintly figure doing something great. So it was the way in which, the different figures come together. But I turn this page for those watching on YouTube. There is a wonderful poem called Hush for the 4 Witches. And it has two sisters who have obviously been sort of ostracized by the sort of puritanical sort of authorities in Scotland in the sort of 16th century. Now, heroines, heroes, yes, to a certain extent, but sort of the situation they're in, I think, is fascinating in this passage of the anthology. The way that one goes from sort of witches to Earl Cassilis's lady to a wonderful one of a wise woman turning into a hare. So these are different ways to look at heroes and different ways to look at villains, I think, through the poetic form.
I think that for me, overall, that was the thought journey I enjoyed the most. Although I did enjoy finding saints mixed in with them all, because so many legendary heroes from the past were saints, and we tend to, on the whole, drop them out of the discussion because of, multi-faith world and all that. It's easier to talk about King Arthur. And the one, is it St. Kevin?
And his blackbird.
And his blackbird.
Oh,
I mean, that's just a fabulous poem. It's Seamus Heaney, I think, isn't it? But it's going to be really tough, Anna. But do you have a favourite poem that you'd like to share with us? So
I mean, I never choose a favourite. Never.
One that you would like to read, then.
I always resist that.
And Anna, I must ask you to give me a page number as well, so I can turn the page.
Yes. Everybody go over to YouTube because it's really a treat.
Should we do If, page 242?
If we all turn to our textbooks, 242.
Yes, that's right.
I've always wanted to say that. So on page 242, so this is in the Beasts section. It's one of the dragon poems of one of Chris's absolutely gorgeous dragons. And this is called If by James Carter. I choose this. This is my daughter's favorite. She is an aspiring paleontologist. So she thought this was wonderful. If dinosaurs were real, then maybe dragons were as well. And perhaps one day they'll find a skeleton beside a craggy cliff, far inside a cave, a backbone and a tail, a jagged skull, and those branch-like bones where the wings would have been, or even a whole dragon, perfectly preserved in Siberian snow, grey-green and scaly, those two top canine fangs just jutting over the jaw, the raging fire of the beast long lost to the deep sleep of the dead, those saggy eyelids closed forever.
Wonderful.
Wonderful.
Thank you. So just before we move on to the illustrations, I just wondered if there was, because it's not just you knew all these already, presumably you had to go and research your subject. Was there a sort of research gem that you found during
so many? I think that I always start an anthology with a little list of things, and I think, oh, well, we must have that. We must have that. But it's always such a pleasure to discover new things. A lot of the contemporary poems were new to me. And I also just love discovering older poems that I just hadn't come across before. There's a lovely, quite grisly Macbeth poem by Walter de la Mare that I found for this, which I didn't know, and the Earl Cassillis's Lady, which Chris mentioned earlier, by Sylvia Townsend Warner. I really, really love that, and I love the illustration that Chris has done of her. There's one by Liesl Müller as well. Müller, I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, who called Sometimes When the Light. And I love it when I find sort of a poet that I hadn't heard of before, and I hadn't heard of her, and I discovered that poem and then went and sort of fell in love with some of her other work as well, which wasn't right for this book. It was just an enormous pleasure for me. So yes, there's always lots and lots that I discover. Loads of them are always new to me.
Yes, and so I mean, obviously, for people listening, it may be we've been talking about this being used in a school context, but I would also emphasize that if you're looking for new ideas for imagination, new sort of ways of looking at fantasy, don't restrict your reading. Dip into anthologies, this anthology and others, because for me, I found really exciting the one about the wise woman turning into a hare. Beautifully
Dan
illustrated.
Hardwick.
Yeah,
Yes.
it was such a beautifully, intensely felt experience. I just thought it was great. Food for thought there. So
would you like to hear it?
yes, I'm going to ask you about your pictures, because this is a particularly fine one as well, but please read it. Nan Hardwick turns into a hare.
I will tell you how it was. I slipped into the hare like a nude foot into a glorious slipper, pushing her bones to one side to make room for my shape so I could settle myself like a child within her. In the dark, I groped for her freedom, gently teasing it apart across my fingers to web across my palm. Here is where our separation ends. I tensed her legs with my arms, pushed my rhythm down the stepping stones of spine. An odd feeling, this, to hold another soul in the mouth like an egg. The aching jaw around her delicate self. Her mind was simple, full of open space and weather. I warmed myself on her frantic pulse and felt the draw of gorse and grass, the distant slate line at the edge of the moor. The air span diamonds out of sea fret to catch across my tawny coat as I began to fold the earth beneath my feet and fly across the heather. The heather.
Thank you.
So that was a Cumbrian witch who could transform herself into a hare. And in this one, this is sort of quite a good example sort of visually for what one can do when one is illustrating a poem. It's got beautiful imagery in it. It sort of speaks for itself in a sense. So what all one wants, I think, as one is turning the pages, is to stop and see a very large hare. A pleasure to draw. And I enjoy sort of inhabiting as an illustrator the white spaces on the page, and then sort of just getting as close as I possibly can to the text. So Nan is represented just as a sort of disembodied foot slipping into the shape of this hare. So the foot is emerging from the text, and you see it in a sort of spirit form entering this rather sort of quivering and sort of staring-eyed hare. And so compositionally, it allowed both space, but also a sort of concentration on exactly what is happening here, the transformation. And that's something I think poetry can give an illustrator. It can give an illustrator a moment, a distillation of a sort of a feeling and a mood. And then the poem does what the poem does. The beautiful words form into sort of images. But as an illustrator, you can just choose a single image to sort of crystallize the thought around, which is very different from what I do in, say, sort of illustrating works of fiction, where there's a narrative thread and one is drawing characters in different sort of situations throughout a book. And what I'm sort of given in something like Heroes and Villains, Anna just gives me a whole range of moments to crystallize as an illustrator. So it's a real pleasure to illustrate poetry in this way.
Well, it reminds me again of our discussion of Alice in Wonderland, because the Mouse's Tale poem feels very much like that, with the emphasis on shape. Chris, I was just going to ask you, because a lot of them are open illustrations in a way. They feel they go beyond the page, but occasionally you'll also box out the text. So on page 4 in Mappa Mundi, you've got, I'll hold it up on my screen. We've got, there we go. We've got the poem boxed out. Is this very much led? You're not told what to do, I presume, but you're led by subject matter and cartography in that case?
Completely. I always think of the sort of book as an object, as something that one is going to hold in one's hands, and the experience of the reader turning pages. And I think sort of visually one wants to just invite the reader onto a page and to sort of focus on what this might be. So it's variety. I mean, having a poem that is completely boxed by my illustrations in a very formal sense, almost decorative, gives a certain mood. And then you can turn the page and have a much freer, open composition, where a figure is running across a vast expanse, maybe. Ozymandias, a huge disembodied head, desert sands drifting away into the distance, gives you that sort of desert-like, arid sense that the poem conveys. And then you can turn the page and have a very different sort of environment on the next page. And it's that sort of progression through. And it can be as simple sometimes as saying, right, let's have a lot of drawing on this page and let's have just a little bit of drawing on this page. Always, it's the primacy of the material. It's what the poem is saying that's most important. And my attempt, I think, is to find a moment in a poem. And an example, I suppose, in this collection would be the poem about Merlin, where by, I think it's David Harmer. Anna, you can sort of correct me, but
Yes.
a wonderful poem about Merlin where there's just a single line about Merlin riding a griffin. There's lots of other things in the poem. It's full of detail, but it's a single line. And I thought, well, that's what you want to see on the page. You want to open this page and go, wow, that's a wizard riding a griffin. Wings spread across the other side of the page. There it is. I defy anyone not to stop and go, I wonder what that's about, and then find all the wonderful imagery within the poem.
Completely. So I've got one serious question for you both, which is, because we're dealing with the matter of fairy tales and legends, that obviously a lot of the content basically there's a lot of marital abuse, child cruelty, neglect, terrible treatment of the world, and also some very bloodthirsty moments.
The Brothers Grimm playbook, in other words.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not as if it's the undisneyfied version of myths and legends. And I just wondered if because this is going to be sitting quite happily on a shelf in a school library somewhere eventually, what are your conversations about this? So, for example, saints' lives, because of the martyrdom of saints, they usually end up in really grisly ways. And it's often, you can go into many a church around the country and see imagery of saints with heads under their arms and all sorts of things. In this case, in the poem St. Margaret of Antioch, you've got the flying head, because that's how she meets her doom in that particular story. I personally think children are fine with this material, but I imagine there is some gatekeeping questions you have in your head when you're drawing and when you're choosing. So what did you make of that? So did you even talk about it?
I mean, I certainly would. I agree that I think children can be wildly bloodthirsty and enjoy plenty of sort of heads flying across the room and what have you. And I think that those sort of legendary tropes occur in so many children's stories. I would, for example, with gods and monsters, particularly the Olympian gods are very rapacious towards women. I wouldn't have included anything that was, very explicit on the sexual violence, which is, I mean, I would love to do a collection for adults where you could really let rip the darkest and most terrible kind of elements of the myths, because there have been some extraordinarily brilliant poems about them. But no, I wouldn't include anything very, very explicit or particularly gruesome in a collection for children. But on the other hand, a lot of the stories are quite dark, and so we don't shy away from what happens to poor Margaret of Antioch.
And
I just think
actually, it's also framed in a way where actually it's like a liberation at the end, isn't it? I don't know if you want to read the last verse of that. Chris, have you got it open?
I've got it open here, and the invitation to draw a sort of severed head sort of flying through the air was irresistible as an illustrator. But it's interesting. One doesn't necessarily have to be gratuitous about it. You don't have to sort of go sort of hammer house of horror. There can be a sort of and sometimes religious art can have that quality, a macabre quality, a contemplative quality, but it can also be very beautiful, even when one is sort of describing sort of terrible sort of events. And this is Margaret of Antioch being swallowed by the dragon. And so the dragon swallowed me. It was like this. I'd given myself to God and said no to marrying a powerful man. Thwarted, my would-be husband threw me in a dungeon, consigned me to damp and darkness and the devil, who came to me in leathery skin, clawed and fanged, his yellow eyes burned, his hell jaws yawned, and gulped me into his red gullet. Down and down I slithered until the cross of Christ I held struck him like a holy fishbone and snagged the helter-skelter of his coiling throat. And I, who was sucked and squeezed in that hot tunnel of foul flesh, was spat and spasmed out again, miraculous. Not that I lived to tell the tale for long. They tried to burn me, but I failed to fry. They tried to drown me, and I came out dry. Third time lucky, they took an iron blade and swung it. See how my head takes to the air. Watch it fly.
Yeah.
Love that poem by Jandine.
I think it's one of the tearing poems, isn't it? I think there's a previous poem with Margaret getting out of the dragon, which is rather fun. A very surprised looking dragon. Yeah, so please do follow up on YouTube because Chris is now showing his very surprised dragon. So Chris, I think you foolishly offered to draw us something. So perhaps we should ask you to draw, well, can we pick a subject?
Well,
Or have
of
you got
course,
something in your mind?
one comes to mind immediately, I think, which is one of the rather magnificent dragons that Anna was kind enough to sort of include in the anthology. And I would invite, as I'm sort of sketching here, the outline of one of the aforementioned dragons, I'd invite Anna maybe to read a dragon poem, any poem, Anna, of your choice. It's got to feature a dragon, and there are a few in this anthology.
So for those who, whilst Anna chooses her poem, I'm very interested to see that Chris starts with the nostrils. I'd always thought people might start with the eye, but no.
Not always. It depends, but it's a good focal point. I always like a sort of the coil of smoke that rises up from a dragon's sort of nostril. And dragons come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. They can be huge and fearsome, the sort of Game of Thrones sort of dragons that are, quite frankly, enormous and terrifying. But you can also get sort of small, sort of laconic dragons, the sort of Eastern, sort of dragon that might sort of befriend Mulan and sort of give her sort of cryptic advice. And you can also get sort of rather wonderful English folk dragons that sort of, exist in the sand dunes outside a little town and cause problems, and I suspect they're not Game of Thrones style dragons. They're more sort of, I don't know, Alan Bennett style dragons who sort of there sort of causing a little trouble with various sort of locals. And it's that sort of breadth, I think, that I really enjoy. And I don't know whether you found a poem, Anna.
I've got The Dragons Are Hiding here, which I love.
Oh, perfect.
Brian Moses. And I really love this one. To be born a dragon hunter is somehow to know that once, a very long time ago, dragons were not just the stuff of dreams. It was a way for young men to fulfill their destinies, to ride off on horseback seeking treasure. It was, first and foremost, a measure of their courage, the best sort of quest. It was a solitary pursuit, 1-to-1, hunter and hunted, the odds even. Sharp eyes, cunning, and surprise all counted, for a lick of flame would be all it took to paralyze. Dragons knew they were young men's quarry. They became elusive, led secluded lives, slept by day, fed at night, easily fled when challenged. Then down the years, dragons disappeared. There were tales, of course, a mountain in Scotland, a labyrinth in Wales, but the trails proved cold. No smoke-blackened caves, no burned-out villages, no graves of would-be dragon hunters. Yet, recently, there were rumours again, the whisper of wing beats in darkness, distant thunder from mountains, a tumult beneath a waterfall where roaring could easily be disguised. Any young warrior out seeking dragons should look again in slate caverns and abandoned mine shafts. They should travel to the hidden sides of mountains, look beneath devil's bridges and daringly dig to discover the silent secret spaces where dragons might be waking. For in a darkening Welsh landscape, with evening purpling the hills, it is easy, so easy to believe, how those of us who would be dragon hunters could one day find them again.
Yes, definitely a would-be dragon hunter in my
Yes.
past. So for those of you who are listening to this, what was happening whilst that poem was being read is an amazing dragon has emerged from hiding out of the white space on the page, thanks to the magic of Chris's pencil. So I'm wondering if we could just have a little practical help for those who are wanting to be a creative or already are creative, but perhaps wanting to make it something which pays some bills. That's the hard part. So Anna, what you're looking at is people reinterpreting legends in their poetry, particularly the modern poems version of this. Do you have any tips for writers who are looking to use some kind of legend that's already out there, be it Robin Hood or King Arthur or Merlin? What do you think they should be thinking of when they're trying to do something for our today, when they're using existing myths and legends?
I think with myths and legends, the best advice is not to be frightened of the source material, I think, because people have been telling and retelling these stories for so many hundreds of years often, that you can get inside them and change the furniture around and sort of make them your own. Because so many people have done that before. That's sort of how they've come down to us, with a little bit of embellishment from hundreds of different imaginations sewn on. So I would sort of advise people to really put their own stamp on those legends. I think they are there to be reinterpreted and reused, and you can discard what you don't need and use what you do, I think.
I mean, that's so important, Anna. I think this is, what you do when you're anthologizing, when you're putting these different poems together, you're giving us perspectives. And I think from the point of view of sort of writing fantasy, one of the things I always enjoy is when I get to hear from some of the minor characters who become actually very major in the writer's imagination. Whenever I'm watching sort of, say an epic dramatization of something, I'm always drawn to the guy at the back who maybe is holding the spear, wondering, I wonder what you've seen, the going on. I know the king's up there and he's got a mighty quest going on, but what's it like down in the sort of Camelot kitchen where, frost has set in and, quite frankly, this armor's chafing and, what's the relationship going on between the cook and the sort of housekeeper, whatever it might be, and I think that's a lovely way in some ways, and I'm always interested in when fantasy sort of brings the aspects of our own reality to the forefront, and so contemporary issues can be reflected extremely well through fantasy, in a way that so things, maybe fantasy exists and endures, because it speaks to some of our sort of primal sort of feelings and whether it be the sort of fear of large and sort of oppressive creatures or embodiments of sort of weather and catastrophe, or the small sort of moments of decision making and sort of small personal quests that we might go on. It's always a good starting point, I think. The inconvenience of fantasy. What is going on behind the quest?
Yeah, so we should rename the hero's journey to the inconvenient journey. Yeah. So Chris, I had a question for you about the sort of practicalities of approaching a publisher as a team, like you did with Paul Stewart. But I also want to ask you about your political cartooning. So the question about that I often meet aspiring writers who are also talented illustrators. And I never know because not having an illustration background, I never know what to say about whether they should go to a publisher with all of their stuff or allow the publisher to broker the marriage between them and an existing illustrator. What's your gut feeling on that one?
Well, it works both ways, I think. So working with Paul Stewart, I think was the two of us actually met at, we both had sons of the same age. We were at their nursery, and we met sort of, at the nursery gates, as it were, and started to talk about the mutual sort of books that we enjoyed, and realized we loved C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and Ursula Le Guin. And, so there was a lot of shared stuff. I think our collaboration really started because Paul was also a fan of the illustrations that accompanied the books, which is not always the case. Sometimes fantasy sort of, famously won't be illustrated until maybe its later iterations. I think it's telling that someone like Tolkien, drew his map. He had this lovely sort of visual imagination that accompanied, his writing. He was also a poet, so he had that sort of quality in what he did. I think there's a sort of, charming illustrations that Charles Dodson did when he was writing the Alice story for Alice Liddell all that time ago. So often stories do begin with images, with stories. I'm a huge fan of Gormenghast, where Mervyn Peake drew characters almost as an aide memoir to sort of give him something to describe in his wonderfully sort of visual writing. So in some senses, sometimes the words have got to sort of, I think words come first always. And as an illustrator, the primacy of the text is what I always sort of believe in. Now, if you can meet a writer and you get on well together, I think there's a sort of way in which you can synchronize your efforts. You can feed off each other's imaginations, one visual, one sort of word-based, and then you can develop something quite unique. Equally, a publisher might say, well, what is it how do we want to package this book? And I believe that books, beautiful books are incredibly important. And I think in the fantasy realm, even more important in a sense, the book as a beautiful object is something we covet. And I think, you have digital forms and adaptation, you name it, but a beautiful book, there's something very magical about that. And of course, with illustrations, it's a way of celebrating the book as an object. And so I believe also publishers can ask illustrators to come in and lend their magic to the what is already a sort of wonderful text. That's not a useful answer for someone sort of pitching, but I would say to any illustrator, if you see a stray poet or writer wandering down the street, just sidle up and sort of, say hello to them and maybe buy them a coffee and gently suggest that their book with these beautiful white spaces might need some illustrations to go with them.
That's a very nice thought. I have to try walking past your house looking desperate. See if you'll invite me in. I have a cheeky question for you, Chris, which is, because we also know you as a political cartoonist and you've been working on this volume of heroes and villains, politics does lend itself to heroes and villains. Have you found things you've been illustrating for Anna creeping into your political cartooning?
Inevitably. I mean, the visual metaphor, I think, in a political cartoon is a gift. It's a wonderful thing. I think Vladimir Putin sitting on his sort of throne of swords, sort of saying, winter is coming, is just, it just works, doesn't it? I think sort of, a blowhard sort of Donald Trump is a sort of, a gift that keeps on giving, with his extraordinary sort of appearance and ridiculous utterances. What I like to do every so often in a sort of fantasy context, I think, and this is just for my own sort of personal pleasure, is draw the incumbent prime minister. It started, I think, as far back as David Cameron, but every so often during each administration, I like to draw whoever's the incumbent sort of asleep at night. That oft asked question, how do you sleep at night? I like to address that, a figure, Cameron or Theresa May or Rishi Sunak or now, Keir Starmer, lying asleep at night, duvet pulled up close over their sort of chins, and visiting them in a sort of, Christmas Carol style will be the problems of the day, which can be characterized, as fiery dragons or hideous trolls or appalling sort of figments of Tolkien's imagination, standing there sort of prodding them with pitchforks or breathing sort of down their necks. And of course, I do what political cartoonists have done down the centuries. I apply judiciously labels. Labels are a great sort of tool for the political cartoonist. The dragon of winter fuel payments, standing menacingly, is an absolute gift. And someone once wrote me a tweet, I think, and said, you're a cartoonist. I bet you label everything. I bet you label fridge. And I just tweeted back, as one does. I don't often do this sort of thing. I just tweeted back and say, you're right. I do label everything, except on my fridge is labeled conspicuous consumption. On you go. It's that sort of thing. Yes, the visual obviously comes in to what I do, and politics is always with us. And I think poems often shine a light on contemporary issues rather well, as we started this conversation with the Lady of Shalott in lockdown. It's extraordinary, isn't it, when you get a contemporary resonance from a poem that has been around for many, many years. And I think an anthology that Anna's compiled, like Heroes and Villains, does exactly that. It gives us lots of, I think the contemporary term is chills.
Yeah, and vibes.
Vibes.
Yes.
Vibes and chills, which is a lovely note to end the conversation about this anthology on. But as a bit of fun, I always ask my guests to transport themselves into any fantasy world at all. It can be Star Wars, it can be Beatrix Potter, down a rabbit hole, up into space. Really, we don't mind. But I want to know, where is the best place, in your view, to go for something? And I was thinking, well, we tend to think the villains are the most exciting part of a story very often. So where would be the best place to be a villain? And so I was thinking, where could you have the most fun and get away with it, do you think? So have you got a favorite? Anna, should we start with you? Have you got a favorite fantasy world where you wouldn't mind putting on the black robe or the high heel shoes or whatever it is in the fantasy world that is the
It's
villain?
very difficult, isn't it? Because they do tend to get their comeuppance at the end.
No, you're going to get away with it. That's the point of this question.
If I get away with it,
Yeah.
I wouldn't mind Jardis in Narnia sweeping around,
Oh, yes.
dropping Turkish delight on my sleigh.
Many centuries of doing that, I think, before the pesky kids come along and ruin the whole gig.
Once you get woken up in Charn, you have some good years before Father Christmas turns back up.
Yes.
He's come and ruin everything. So maybe I'd be her. She's terribly glamorous.
Very good. Yes, it is a glamorous one, that one.
Glamorous role.
So we've got some glamour on the table here. How about you, Chris? Have you got a favorite place to go?
Well, obviously, I mean, I was on a plane going to the Auckland Writers' Festival a little while ago, and a nice young man sitting next to me, we struck up a conversation. I said, "Where are you going?" He said, "I'm going to the Shire," he said.
Yeah.
So he was actually going to the film set in New Zealand, and I had the good fortune to be invited to go to the Weta workshop in Wellington on my trip to New Zealand. And a lovely chap, Richard, who runs the workshop, just showed me around the workshop. And it was just full of everything you would need to be both a hero or a villain. And I've got to say, I was very, very taken with a life-size, and when I say life-size, I mean a fantasy life-size, boot, armored boot. And it was Sauron's boot from the beginning of the Lord of the Rings films. And it's huge. They build it sort of life-size. So Sauron towering above with that ring of power on his finger, that was his boot. And I stood and I looked at that and I thought, wow, that is very impressive. So, I think in a contemporary sense, going forward to possibly the fourth or fifth age of Middle Earth, obviously things have calmed down a bit. Tourism has taken over. You can now maybe sort of go to Mordor, and it's been sort of rewilded in the most perfect way. But there've been stirrings, there've been local sort of civic sort of meetings and stuff. And there's this guy, walking around. He's got a sort of, unconvincing comb over and tends to wear a baseball cap that says "Make Mordor Great Again." And, things aren't looking good. So yeah, we're waiting, I think, for the final sort of battle sometime in November to see whether the forces of Sauron actually resurge, or whether we can return to a sort of, more benign time. My money's on Gandalf.
I can see the next political cartoon being sketched even as we talk there. Just the Hobbiton, by the way, if you didn't do it, it's the best day out that I've had. Took my family there in January, and even though I live in the Shire, literally, I live in a village that's like Hobbiton, I still enjoyed the Shire. You've both nicked probably my two favorite fantasy worlds, but I've got to go different. So I was thinking that a really fun place, I think, to be a villain would be Beatrix Potter's world. Because there is something just delicious. Particularly, one of my favorite ones when I was growing up was The Tale of Two Bad Mice, having the run of a doll's house.
The doll's house.
About that, which is intriguing. So maybe a spin as some wild creature with, evil intent.
And I think when you reread, for example, Jemima Puddle Duck,
Oh, yes.
I mean, it's absolutely so dark and grueling.
Don't talk to strangers.
Yeah.
You've got the Pike with Jeremy Fisher, not a villain in some senses, because it's just doing what pikes do, but that terrified me as a child. And at my local lake in Norfolk, I was just recently asked to draw these giant fish that they fish out of the lake. The fishermen hold them as trophies.
Oh, yeah, the classic thing.
And they give them nicknames. And I was given a lovely job to actually draw each of these giant carp with their nicknames as a commission. And I thought of Jeremy Fisher then. I can't look at a lake without thinking of Jeremy.
Well, Jeremy. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining me. It's been an absolute delight talking to you both. And I encourage everybody to go and get their copy of Heroes and Villains, poems about legends, and feel inspired both as illustrator and also as writers. So thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to Mythmakers podcast, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. Visit oxfordcenterforfantasy.org to join in the fun. Find out about our online courses, in-person stays in Oxford, plus visit our shop for great gifts. Tell a friend and subscribe wherever you find your favourite podcasts worldwide.